I want to talk to you about the people, the Persian people. 92 million Persian people, the vast majority of whom want to live in freedom. I want to talk to you about humanity. I want to talk to you about Judeo-Christian values and beliefs. Some of you may have gone to church today or temple, or you just have these moral and ethical beliefs. Maybe you've been taught them, maybe they're intuitive. You know right from wrong and good from evil. So I want to talk to you about the tens of millions of people in Iran who for 47 years have been treated like animals, who've been imprisoned, tortured, raped, murdered by the tens of thousands, who've been told what kind of music they can and cannot listen to. I want to talk about young women, the daughters, the sisters, the mothers in Iran, who are forced to cover their heads and have no rights, let alone equal rights, and are subjected to the worst kind of abuses. I want to talk to you about the young people generally in Iran, who want to enjoy their youth, experience new things, happy things, who want to learn new things, who are the primary target of Iran's secret police, who are being rounded up, who are being summarily executed, mostly in secret. I want to talk to you about those in our country who fancy themselves liberals, human rights activists, civil libertarians, who don't give a damn about any of this, who don't speak out, who will not speak out, because the Democrat Party or the political entity they belong to, the Marxists and the Islamists, they hate America and Israel so much, they'd rather tens of thousands more Iranians die horrible deaths than see our country defeat this homicidal regime. They're not in the streets. They're not marching. Where are all the religious leaders? There's some. Where are they? I don't hear them. Do you hear them? I want to talk about the silence of the so-called women's groups, who are so tied into the fanatical and radical left that they haven't said a word about the mass abuse and rapes of the women and girls by the Iranian regime. Nothing. No marches, no press conferences. They're not on TV. Where are they? Nowhere. I want to talk about the so-called religious left in our country, that despite wholesale slaughter of innocent civilians, they're carrying the water for the so-called anti-war movement. I want to talk about those who say the Iranian regime's nuclear threat was not imminent, that this is a war of choice, that this is an illegal war, and so forth. They care not at all, not one whit, that they are not only giving aid and comfort to this horrific enemy, but they are encouraging this enemy to slaughter, to execute, to rape, to torture, and to do what homicidal regimes do. Because they know, the enemy, that these people are in the bag. There is nothing, I repeat, nothing honorable or righteous about any of these groups, any of these individuals, and about Americans who are either silent or worse, pretending this genocide is not taking place or knowing it's taking place and turning the other cheek. Shame on those who think this way. Shame on those who are not speaking out. Shame on those who are not acting, particularly those who are in a position to do so. I want to talk about the isolationists, the neo-fascists, who accuse our president and our country and our military of imperialism and colonialism in this war, who accuse Israel and the prime minister there, Netanyahu, of dragging us into a war, who accuse Jews of controlling the president, Jews controlling our foreign policy, and all the rest of the Jew hatred they spew, while the Persian people are being slaughtered and abused. You all disgust me the most. I want to talk about the fact that despite all the news coverage, all the attention to the deals, that the Persian people are told, to the extent anything is said about them, that the conditions for overthrowing the Iranian regime, a fully armed military security force that numbers 150,000 or more and is further supported by Islamist terrorist militias from Iraq and elsewhere, that now is the time to rise up. To rise up with what? Did they not already rise up in January only to be slaughtered by the tens of thousands and systematically imprisoned? And as I speak, executions occurring left and right? The knocks on the doors, like the SS in Berlin, dragging people out of their homes and out of their businesses? They can rise up. If we want to encourage them to rise up, and I don't think we have to encourage them very much, they've already demonstrated these are courageous people who want liberty. These are Western-type people. If we help arm them, they can rise up. They can rise up if we help arm them. We've done this before to help people seek freedom. People who don't number as many as the Persian people number. People who didn't demonstrate, as these people have demonstrated, that they truly want their liberty and they want their lives back. I just read that Turkey, Erdogan, opposed us arming the Kurds. Since when does Erdogan, a National Socialist Islamist, who's in NATO, for goodness sakes, dictate to the West or anybody else what we will or will not do? He's a problem in and of himself, as is his homicidal regime that throws people in prison, that disappears them without due process. I hope we're not listening to Turkey. I doubt that we are. But there's no question that we have the capacity to arm these people, or some of these people, or to help organize a resistance. We did it before. Our CIA had the capacity to do it before. Does it not have the capacity to do it again? Do we not have the will to do this, which would have benefits across the board, remove the regime and free the people? And any threat to any future nuclear development and ballistic missile development, isn't that a good thing? For the Persian people, for the American people, for the people in the Middle East and all over the world? There could be 1,000 reasons not to help these people, not to act. And I've no doubt they've been laid down and have been laid out. But there's one reason that trumps them all. It's more important than them all. Humanity. The will of humanity. The great late chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Sachs, who passed away a few years ago. He said, when people come to me and they say, why did God allow the Holocaust to occur? Rabbi Sachs said, and I paraphrase, God did not allow the Holocaust to occur. Humanity allowed the Holocaust to occur. Humanity allowed the Holocaust to occur. The issue is whether we have the will and our fellow human beings have the will to help come to the rescue of other human beings, when in fact we are in a position to do so because never before has this Iranian Nazi regime been on its back as it is today. And to be very clear, that is thanks to our president, President Donald Trump. That is thanks to our Secretary of War, to our Secretary of State, to our generals, and our military. That is thanks to the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his ministers, and his military. But let me be clear about our country. The only president with the courage, the wisdom, the fortitude to confront this Nazi-like regime, this mass-murdering, nuclear-obsessed, Islamist enemy, the world's enemy, is Donald Trump. And unlike other such circumstances around the world where genocide is taking place, and as a practical matter, we can't get involved in all of them. In Iran, we have the opportunity to do something about it. Now, we're at the door. We're at the door. We can hear the people begging us. They hear our bombs, they hear our missiles, or they did. Despite the regime turning out the lights and turning off all means of communication, we know damn well what's going on there. Iran is the biggest concentration camp in human history right now. We know damn well what's going on. Near the end of World War II, when concentration camps are being liberated, one camp in particular, General Dwight Eisenhower, he insisted that his fellow four-star generals accompany him and walk through the concentration camp, was shocked and disgusted. And he wrote General Marshall, he wrote the president, he wrote the Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, and he said, never before have I ever seen such evil. This is a man that led our armed forces in World War II. Never before have I seen such inhumanity. It was so bad, the stench from rotting bodies, that George Patton refused to go into one of the buildings because he said he had seen enough. They were all horrified. Men who had seen everything, but they'd never seen that. They had never seen that. We don't have that excuse. Modern technology, and for other reasons, we know what's going on in that country. We know what's taking place. We pedestrians, we've seen it on the internet, and it's hard to look at. Let us not make that mistake. I already believe it was a mistake when the slaughter that took place on October 7, 2023, at the Nova Festival grounds, videotaped, not by the press, but by the subhuman animals who committed those monstrous acts of inhumanity. They videotaped it. I think it was a mistake that those videotapes weren't widely released. As horrible as they are, as the parents didn't want them released, and it's certainly understandable. But I think this horrific spread of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred and Israel hatred that is taking place in virtually every capital in the West and beyond, including in our country, through podcasters, through organized groups, I think this would have gone a long way to blunt their lies and to stop what's taking place. Let's not make that mistake again.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.